Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes, so just sit back and relax, and we'll be with you in a moment. Thank you. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started today. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you here for our second to last webinar in our Recover, Rebuild, and Renew efforts. For those of you that don't know who I am, my name is Michael Ibrahim, Program Manager here at the Mass Cultural Council and our Cultural Investment Portfolio Program. Our focus is grants and services for nonprofit cultural organizations. And with that in mind, we are super excited to bring in our friends from Mass Creative to talk about federal and state advocacy 101. As I mentioned, this workshop is part of the Mass Cultural Council's Recover, Rebuild, and Renew efforts to help organizations come back from COVID-19. This spring, we've been offering 2 free workshops every week in the areas of financial management, legal issues, human resources, board governance, management, and our final topic today and next Tuesday, advocacy. It's a total of 45 webinars. So if you've missed one of those, don't be afraid of that. You can always watch them afterwards. As we go at the very end of today, I'm going to put a link in the chat with a list of all the recordings that you can go back. We started this on February 2nd. So we've been doing it this whole spring. Joining us today from Mass Creative are Emily Ruddick and G. Quach. They're going to come on in just a second, but a few ground rules as we get going. Feel free to say hi in the chat. You know, sometimes in webinars it's hard because we don't get to see each other. So if you just want to give a little hi, maybe your organization that you're here representing, or if you're an individual, that's great as well, just to kind of show who's here. This session has automatic captionings. If you've been on webinars and meetings with Mass Creative and Mass Cultural Council, you know that for us, we have auto-generated captionings on all our meetings and webinars. If you find that this is distracting, you can also hide subtitles in the closed captioning options at the bottom of Zoom. If you need additional accommodations to ensure your participation at any Mass Cultural Council webinar, just let us know when you register, and we'd be happy to do that. We have a session that is full of interactivity. So the Q&A is going to be your friend. That's a great option to ask questions and also maybe ask a question anonymously. We found that this feature is very popular. You may not want to identify yourself or your organization with a question, so know that you can always ask a question anonymously through the Q&A. And I know Emily is going to put a few resources in the chat box, but you can use that as well. This session is being recorded and will be available on the Mass Cultural Council's YouTube channel probably tomorrow. So be on the lookout for that. Since you've registered for today, I have your email, so you will get an email from me when that recording is all ready to be viewed. The session runs for an hour, including time for conversations. And with that, I'd love to turn it over to Emily and G.
Hello all. It's so good to be with you in community. I'm Emily, and G, do you want to say hello?
Hi, everyone.
Hi. So we are really excited to do our first of 2 conversations about advocacy and government affairs. And so I do want to start out by just acknowledging that we're going to talk about laws, we're going to talk about policy, and we're going to talk about decisions and structures of government that have historically harmed communities and individuals disproportionately, and have led to the marginalization and minoritization of some individuals and some communities. These include Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color. And so we're going to be thinking about that and talking about that a little bit more as we go along, but we want to acknowledge that for some, this might be a difficult topic area, and that we are working to try to help unpack a lot of these items so that we can think about how to change systems and to work within systems for more equity. So with that, I'm just going to do a little quick intro about Mass Creative. Mass Creative is a statewide arts and cultural advocacy organization. We were founded in 2012 with really the focus around making sure that the needs of the creative sector and the cultural community was understood by elected officials and decision makers. We do that through three ways. So we ask for what we need, we share stories and share the data that tells the impact of the field, and then we work to provide tools and resources to all of you to make sure that you are effective in your advocacy efforts. So this conversation today is something that we love to talk about. So I'm going to start out with a question. So if you wouldn't mind using the panel, using the chat function, what is advocacy? What do you think advocacy is? Any takers? You can write in the chat. You can use the Q&A function. Standing up for something. That's great. Other thoughts? Making the case for the importance of an issue. Making your voice heard. Those are great. Those are great. For us, we would agree with all of those. And we would say, quite simply, for us, advocacy is asking for what we need, right? Making clear the things that we need in order to be successful, in order for our communities to be successful, in order for us to live healthy, bright, and connected lives. So for us, we think about it in sort of three ways. There's sort of three levels of advocacy that you can talk about. So the first one is personal advocacy, and I will be very transparent here. These are sort of my personal advocacy stories. So as a young person, I had early experiences with theater that made me a more confident and creative person. So that's my personal advocacy story, right? And then if the organization where I did a lot of that theater was called the Harwich Junior Theater in Harwich, Massachusetts. And so that organization could also tell their advocacy story, which is the Harwich Junior Theater provides meaningful creative experiences to hundreds of young people annually, right? And then the policy advocacy would be arts and culture are a public good that provide benefits to residents in the Commonwealth, and they're worthy of public investment. The state should ensure that everyone in Massachusetts can access the benefits of creativity, right? So those are sort of three levels. So from the personal to the organizational to the larger policy conversation. Does that make sense? I'm gonna assume you're all giving thumbs up. So let's talk a little bit more about what is policy. So another question, what is public policy to you? What does that mean? What does policy mean? Any thoughts? Do you use policy? Do you have policy within your organizations? Got it. Methods. So methods of addressing public needs. Interesting. So that, I'm going to say that is close, but for us, when we talk about public policy, we're talking about the laws and regulations, court decisions, and local ordinances that come up, right? Yep. Okay. So we have one. So legislative, ethical, or other types of guidance to direct actions and financial decisions. Absolutely. That is totally right. So policy can be legislation. It could be laws and bills. It can also be ballot questions, right? Or, those are every once in a while we get one on our ballots that says, so for example, there was one about the right to repair on our last ballot that is about constitutional changes, right? Like it's another way to think about changing laws, right? And then those laws, those decisions, those regulations, and those court decisions are the things that keep us within our communities, right? And as the answer included, I think this is a really good point, like help direct the priorities about how our government is spending money. And that happens on the federal, state, and local level. So why should arts and cultural leaders engage in advocacy and public policy, right? Like we're not law firms, we're not running for office ourselves, but we think it's really important. So why do you think we should be engaging in advocacy and public policy decisions? To point out immediate needs, yes, right? That's asking for what we need. Yep, because legislators and policymakers like to hear from their voters and be considered responsive. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep, because those leaders are the voice for the community at large to ensure a future for the sector and public life. These are all fantastic answers. And yes, our government depends to highlight the importance of arts and culture to both quality of life and economic health. These are great answers. So for us, our government depends on individuals and communities sharing it depends on individuals and communities sharing their needs with elected officials, right? Like we have a representative government. We elect leaders to make decisions for us, to help us to make the laws, but they need our input in order to do that. And so that's why we need to advocate. And then for us as a sector, the reason why we need to advocate is because if we don't ask for what we need, our lawmakers won't do the things that we want them to do, right? And one of the things that I feel is a really important piece to mention here is that one of the things that we talk about advocating a lot at Mass Creative is around public investment, state dollars for arts and culture, right? Through the Mass Cultural Council budget. And every year Mass Creative, shares out opportunities for everyone to write into their elected officials and share why they think it's an important thing to have more state dollars channeled to the arts and cultural sector through the Mass Cultural Council. Time and time again, the arts community turns out in record numbers to share their messages of support with lawmakers. And it's one of the reasons why lawmakers are so willing to think about the needs of our community. Community leaders are paying attention and are sharing their needs with them. So that's a really important, it's why we do what we do, right? So I am going to take a brief sojourn here, and we're going to talk a little bit we're going to go to our Civics 101, right? So we're going to talk about how our government is set up. And so this is the case on both the federal and the state level, right? So even though I used a state example. So we have three branches of government. We've got the executive, the legislative, and then the judicial. The legislative writes the laws, the executive enforces the laws, and the judicial interprets the laws, right? In Massachusetts, we have a governor. The governor appoints cabinet members who run various agencies. That includes housing and economic development, health and human services, health and human services, transportation, right? Those are a couple of them. Then there is a legislature, and the legislature, there is a House and a Senate, and those are different bodies that are elected. The House has more members, and the Senate has fewer and sort of larger districts. And underneath both of them, they have their own leadership structures, and they have committees, and those committees are organized to review various topics within bills. So all of the economic development bills go to the Economic Development Committee. All of the bills that relate to arts and culture go to the Tourism and Economic Development Committee, right? The same thing on the Senate side. There are committees there too. And then in the judicial side, right, there's a Supreme Court, there's an appeals court, and there's trial court, right? And they're all interpreting the laws when there's a challenge to them. So I just want to sort of give like an overall little view of what our government, how our government is organized, right? And how, and that will inform how we're talking about how laws are made, where you can advocate. So we are now going to take a little beat, and I want to just pause and see if folks have questions. If you are all ready to proceed, we can keep going if that's cool. All right. So let's talk. We're gonna continue in our Civics 101 frame for just a moment. I don't know if any of you remember this little icon from Schoolhouse Rock and a cartoon called "I'm Just a Bill," but we are going to talk about how a bill becomes a law. So here, get ready for this. It's a little bit of a jam-packed slide. So when we're talking about bills, they start with legislators, right? So, and they start with constituents oftentimes, right? So a legislator is talking with his or her constituents. The constituents are saying, you know, it's really difficult for us to get things done because there's no law that helps us navigate this issue. And the legislator says, well, let's write a law. And so the legislator is responsible for drafting and submitting the law. And that in Massachusetts happens every 2 years, approximately. So we have a full-time legislature, which means that our legislature is always working, and it runs for 2-year sessions. So the newest session, we're in the 192nd session, and it started January of 2021, and it'll run through its first year, right? It'll end in 2021, December. It'll go through the next year, right? So it'll go through its second year, which will start in 22. And the end of that session officially will be in December of 2022. And this is important because we're going to talk about this little legislative pathway. So in this year, or this session, it was in February, but at the very beginning of the session, legislators can submit bills. They can file their bills. And the first thing that then happens is those legislators reach out to their colleagues and they ask to get co-sponsors, right? They want to get their co-sponsors, they want to get their colleagues to say, yes, I support that bill too. And that's important because the more support from co-sponsors a bill has, the more likely it is for the committee to really take it, to consider it strongly and think about recommending it to its next step. So, you know, co-sponsors are collected and the bill is assigned to a committee, right? As I talked about, economic development, education, or tourism, arts, and cultural development. And that committee then is responsible for reviewing the bill. And they can do, they do a couple of things. They hold a hearing. So this is an opportunity for all of us as the general public to share our opinions about that bill. And you can do it in one of two ways. So the first way is you can write written testimony and submit it. And the other way is you can actually go to the hearing and speak in front of the committee and say why you care about the bill being passed or why you think it is absolutely a horrible idea for the bill to be passed, right? So the committee then takes all of that information and they make a decision. And they can do three things. They can report it favorably, which means it moves on to the next step. Usually it means it goes to another committee. They can report it negatively and then it just doesn't go anywhere, or they can report it to study. And when it's reported to study, it's a little like them saying, we don't want to say no, but we don't want to say yes. So it goes to study, and most likely the bill doesn't go anywhere, right? So what you really want, if you're in favor of the bill, you really want the bill to be reported favorably out of committee. As I said, sometimes it goes to another committee. So a lot of the bills that Mass Creative follows, they start with the Tourism, Arts, and Cultural Development Committee. They get, if they move out, they get reported favorably, and they tend to go to Ways and Means. Ways and Means is an incredibly important committee. They're the ones who decide how things get paid for. They're the ones who decide what things should be paid for. And so a lot of bills end up with Ways and Means. And so Ways and Means will then review it. They'll go through the committee process. And if the committee decides, they will take it to the floor, right? So they'll go to second reading and it'll get a floor debate. And this is the point where legislators get to talk about their support for the bill, or they get to say why they don't support the bill. They can also offer up an amendment. So an amendment is literally doing that. It's amending the bill. So for example, say the bill is about changing the color of stop signs from red to blue. An amendment could be added, but that says, yes, the stop sign will be changed from red to blue, but we want to make sure all of the font is in white, right? We don't want it to be in black, or we don't want it to be in blue, because then nobody could read them. So amendments are offered, and that co-sponsorship piece is allowed as well. Eventually the bill, right? So all the amendments, there's floor debate, then the House or the Senate votes on it, and it goes to third reading. And that basically is when the committee on third reading goes through the bill with a fine-tooth comb. They want to make sure that the bill is written correctly. They want to make sure it's not contradicting another piece of law, or if it is, they know that, and it's made clear, right? They want to make sure that it's going to pass muster in case it has to be interpreted by the judicial branch. So once that happens, usually bills go from the House, they make their way over to the Senate. It goes it goes over to the Senate, and then it repeats those steps. So it gets first reading, then it goes to a floor debate, then it goes to third reading. And then if the bill on the House side isn't identical to the one on the Senate side, right, because they have the opportunity to add amendments, it goes to a conference committee, and the conference committee is responsible for reconciling both versions of the bill, right? So that they match. And then the conference committee comes out with a report. They say, this is the version we think we should all vote on, and it's passed by the legislature, usually. And then it goes to the governor to either be signed or vetoed. And if it's vetoed by the governor, the legislature has the opportunity to override that veto. They literally take a vote and they say, nope, we don't agree with the governor vetoing that bill. We are going to say, yes, it's the law, and that's what we want to do, right? And then the bill is no longer a bill, it's a law. I'm going to pause here because that was a lot of information. Questions? You are always welcome to add a question as I am talking, I promise. I also want to just pause and add to the chat one second. So our legislature is kind of great, and they have a pretty useful website. And on the website, you can see all of the bills that have been filed and the progress or the status of those bills. You can see which committee they were assigned to. You can see at what stage they're in. Did they get a hearing yet? Have they gone to the floor? Have amendments been added? So that's a really good resource that I wanted to share. I'm going to go quickly through the budget process because I'm seeing a question. Yep. So an organization has a couple of different places where they can actually be part of the process. They can be part of the process when the bill is filed and when they're urging for co-sponsors, right? So if a bill is filed, an organization or an individual can call their legislator and say, I see that there's a bill that would support the arts in Massachusetts. I really hope you'll consider supporting it and becoming a co-sponsor, because it would do a lot of really great things for our city, for your district, for our organization. Then the next time that an organization or an individual can really can get involved is during that committee process. So you can submit oral testimony, you can go and talk at the hearing, or you can submit written testimony. And then again, when it goes to floor debate, right, and there are amendments given, If you don't want that bill to be changed at all, if you don't agree that the font on the blue stop signs should not be white, you can write in and say, I don't want you to support that amendment to your legislator, right? Again, when it goes to conference committee and you've got those two versions of the bill, if you like one version better than the other version, you can write into your legislator and you can write into those conference committee members to say, I really want the Senate version, or I really want the House version. And then finally, when it's passed and it goes to the governor, you have another opportunity. You can write to the governor. You can say, I really want you to sign that bill. I really don't want you to make any changes. Here's why it's going to do amazing things for the arts and cultural community in Massachusetts. Okay. So I hope that answered the question. Great. So there are bills that are about changing laws that affect us, right? And, make it so that stop signs are different colors, or make it so that we can have more public art on buildings, on state-owned buildings. And then there's a set of bills that are about how money is spent, and they are budget bills, right? And so this is a process that I'm sure many of you who are connected to the Mass Cultural Council or connected to Mass Creative understand we are involved with every year, right? Because every year through a state budget process, and actually a federal budget process, because it happens on the federal level too, our government makes decisions about what they're going to spend our public dollars on. And for us at Mass Creative, we really believe that a budget is an articulation of priorities and of values, right? And so we want to make sure that we're involved in that. We want to make sure that public dollars are being spent and shared and allocated for arts and culture so that everyone in Massachusetts can access the benefits of creative expression and cultural participation. So here's the budget process. Once again, it starts in January, early every year, right? And the governor releases their budget. And it's their proposal for how spending should happen in Massachusetts. And then it goes to the legislature. And the first stop is to the House Ways and Means. Remember, I talked about Ways and Means Committee. They are the ones who take up that version from the governor, and they create their own version. And many times their version looks completely different than what the governor proposed. Then there is House debate. That's a time where legislators can offer amendments for what they think should be included in the spending plan if it wasn't included in the House Ways and Means version. And then after debate, the House votes to pass a final version. It gets sent over to Senate Ways and Means. Senate Ways and Means does the same thing. They come up with their version of a budget. Oftentimes it looks a lot closer to the House version than it does the governor's version, but it's probably got some specifics in there. Then the Senate debates, they can offer amendments. Then the Senate passes their version. And then a conference committee is appointed so that they can reconcile the differences between the House budget and the Senate budget, right? So they go back and forth, they do some horse trading, they come up with a final version, the legislature passes it, and it's sent to the governor. And the governor can do three things. The governor can sign it into law and just say, yep, everything looks good, let's spend the money this way. They can veto the whole thing. Or they can do something called a line item budget. And this is where the governor can go in and cross out specific lines or specific parts of the budget and put in other things, right? And so if it's vetoed, or if there's a line item veto, then it goes back to the legislature, and the legislature has to deal with the line items that have been vetoed. Oftentimes, the majority of the line item vetoes get overridden, and it gets sent, and it becomes our budget for the year. Sometimes there's more disagreements and it takes a little longer, right, to override some of those vetoes. But that's the budget process. And so I said it starts in January. Constitutionally, it really has to be done by the end of July. Oftentimes it ekes out even farther, right? Like the legislature is negotiating, it goes farther. The governor has 10 days after he or she receives the budget to either sign veto or line item veto. And then after those 10 days, they return it. And then it takes a little bit longer for the Senate for the legislature to deal with those overrides. But ideally, what we really want to see is by September of every year, we've got a full budget, right? Because that's how the state agencies are able to spend the money to provide the services that all of us count on. And that's everything from making sure that the traffic lights work to making sure that there are grants so that every young person in Massachusetts can go to field trips, right? Okay, I'm going to pause now and check and see if there are any questions. Seeing none, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, G.
Thanks, Emily. This is one of those times where I feel like Zoom is very limiting, because ideally, I would prefer to be in the same room with everyone so we can have a more robust conversation about this, because there is the simple facts of the situation, but there are sort of realities that intermix with this process. Emily mentioned earlier that this system, even though we understand how everything works, has been marginalizing for many. And so to dive into some of that conversation, because Mass Creative focuses our work in big bucket areas of advocating for more resources to the sector and trying to ensure that we have an equitable distribution of those resources, and that our sector is reflective of an equity that is just to all its participants. So with that in mind, I wanted to have this conversation. And please, if you have anything comes to mind or any comments, just throw it in and we'll deal with it as we go along. So this question, so is all this worth it? All that stuff Emily just shared, it's complicated, and I might have to say that it's deliberately so. The less people who participate in this process, the more that those who do participate benefit from it. So is this process worth it to do? First answer is yes, or else Emily and I wouldn't be doing this or even have a job. And the second part is yes, because she also mentioned that you don't get what you don't ask for. And we believe that this work needs to be on every org and director's list of to-dos. It should be on the same plane as fundraising, programming, and advocacy, because what we're trying to do is shape an environment and a culture that makes it easier for us to ask for and do our work. So it's not just the specifics of, oh, I need more of this. I need more of this in order to do my job. It's about how can we set up a practice where these are priorities and our asks will be much better received. So the question is, are professional lobbyists more effective than average folks? I'm gonna say yes and no. So by that, I mean, are they more effective? Yes, because they're paid full-time to do this work. They have a wealth of resources to execute it. But the way we are working, the people we serve don't have access to these resources. So we have to go the hard way. And the hard way is galvanizing and mobilizing the masses, our constituents. And these workshops are broken into two. So this week, we're gonna stay a little bit general and cover sort of like the broad strokes. And then at the next workshop, we'll dive a little deeper into the nitty gritty of what organizing and advocacy at the grassroots really means. But I'll touch back on that. So, which leads to my next point. You don't have a choice to advocate, if I'm being completely honest, because if you don't advocate, advocacy is still going to happen by others. And to the last question about are lobbyists better? They are. You can see by this stat. These are 2019 stats, because 2020 is not accurate representation of where we are at. So in 2019, the fossil fuel industry got $2 billion in subsidies. 20 billion. In that same year, federal, state, and local funding for the arts totaled 1.39. And that's because, to me, the amount of advocacy and access to decision makers. This is what we're fighting against. Can you imagine what our sector could do with $20 billion for the arts, as opposed to those benefits going to the fossil fuel industry? And just to give you context to where we are now, with Biden in office, his proposed budget is raising funding to the NEA by 20% to a total of $201 million. 10% of the subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. So this is the reasons these are the reasons why we need to advocate for the arts, because other people are advocating for their sectors and not necessarily all benefiting everybody. So thank you. So the way we think about it, we know there is sort of this immediacy that all nonprofits are focused on, like how do I fund next year? How do I fund programming? But we think advocacy needs to be thought of in this sort of long-term goal. So advocating for the big picture. These are just very broad things to keep in mind while we think about advocacy. Advocate for the whole. So when you are advocating, you're not necessarily advocating just for your organization and what your organization needs. Most likely, the things you need are needed by other orgs as well. So to think in those terms of how does the fulfillment of my org's needs or my individual needs as an artist benefit the larger whole. Think about your goals in advocacy in the immediate and the long term. And by that, I mean, the things we want to see, the changes, are multi-stepped. There's nothing that's going to happen in one campaign cycle or one bill that's going to make the changes we want to see. So how do all these things fit together? How does achieving this short-term passing of a bill lead to that greater equitable sector that's fully funded? Give me 1 second, I want to answer. Are the number of average people advocates more effective than individual but powerful VIP advocates? Well, you guys are asking these bigger questions. Once again, I'm sorry to do this. I'm going to say both. We are trying to shift. On one hand, VIP and powerful advocates make that easier, but our belief is that that's not what we want to lean on, because our goal in the long run is not just advocacy, but advocacy for an equitable sector. And sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say, G, can I also hop in here? Is that okay?
Yeah, please.
So I think it is both. I think I'm gonna back G up. It's both. It is about powerful VIP advocates as well as average people, right? At the end of the day, every elected official is responsible to the voters that got them elected. And it takes a lot of people to get elected. And if that elected official understands that a lot of people who vote in their district or in their state care about an issue, they're going to pay attention to that. But they're only going to pay attention to it if they hear from them, right? So a lot of average people coming together, uniting and in shared messaging about the things that they need are incredibly effective and are incredibly powerful. And it also helps to have some grass tops, powerful VIP advocates who are leading the charge as well, right? So we need a healthy mix of both.
Thank you, Emily. And I would qualify it in this way. Powerful people in powerful positions make things easier, as long as the power structure remains that they are representing the needs of the individual and the masses. So I think, yes, we acknowledge that in certain positions have more access and power, but we want to keep in mind that we don't want to lean into it to the point where that they dictate policy. We want to keep in mind the masses dictate policy and they support the execution of that, which is what elected office is about. Okay, going back. So, oh, can you back up 1 second, Emily? Yeah. So having immediate and long-term goals is important because, like I said, whether we win or lose the immediate goal, we want to every step we take to walk us closer to those long-term endeavors, which leads me to the other part, which is organizing with equity in mind. We are not looking to replace faces in existing power structures. We are claiming that the way things are working now benefits some and doesn't benefit many. And we don't want to just switch faces. We want a structure and a system that benefits everyone equitably. And so when we are advocating, we want to keep that intersectionality in mind, meaning arts is related to housing, related to labor, related to all these, related to accessibility. And we don't want the forward movement of the arts community come at the cost of these other sectors. Thank you. You can give me the next one. So keeping this in mind, we're thinking about how we Mass Creative organize at the roots. Number one, having elect allies into office. We're going to cover some of this in the next one about what you can and cannot do with a 501c3. So do your election stuff on your own time. But having someone who sees the same value as you, the value of art, the value of human labor, all that kind of stuff, makes all the other stuff much easier. So the step one, make sure you have allies in office. Two, build relationships with the lawmakers and their staff and do it right now. Don't wait until you have a specific need of them. So begin to sort of have conversations. Who are people who are already sort of leaning into prioritizing the arts? How can I start conversations with them about what your vision is, what your role in the community is, how your work benefits the community? Have all these conversations ahead of time. And Emily always tell people their staff is sometimes more important because their staff is setting up the workload. So having relationships with them are really important. But that's not enough. That's the grass top. We need to build the electoral base, meaning when you go to these elected officials, need to demonstrate to them that you represent a larger whole and not just yourself or your org. So having a large constituency that understands your work, what you're advocating for, and how your advocacy benefits them is important. We at Mass Creative call this case making. So we believe that arts is important and valuable to the community. We need to help the public understand that and be able to articulate it so they can support us when we say, hey, we need more money for the arts. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier about the intersectionality of the world, we need to build partnerships with other sectors. When it comes down to resources are limited, we don't want to be put in a position where we're siloed and fighting with other sectors that we believe in as well. Does the environment need to fight against the arts, labor, housing, all those kind of things? So it's better that we begin to develop these partnerships so that we can advocate for these things together, and in the end makes us all more powerful and more influential. Next one, please. So that's just a general sort of like overview of the way we kind of think about organizing. I wanted to, there's more details. I mean, we say this and it's like it's easy work, but it's not, obviously. And we'll get more into those details in the next one. But I wanted to take some time to see if anybody had questions or concerns or anything about what we just shared as a model.
And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can look at G and I together if you so desire. G, one of the things that, while we're waiting for folks to type in their questions, one of the things that you brought up in your last slide about building the electoral base or building a base, right? It's really interesting to think about because, you know, when we're talking about arts and cultural organizations, our work is about connecting people and serving communities. And it makes me think about how every arts organization has patrons or members or board members, right? Who are all there because they care about engaging with the arts or engaging with history or culture, right? And so those are potentially, that's your base right there. Like, can you imagine what would happen if every arts and cultural organization in Massachusetts sent out a note to their audiences, right, to their email list saying like, hey, there's a big bill coming up that would really benefit arts and culture in Massachusetts. Like, make sure your lawmaker hears from you about why you care about arts and culture. That kind of ripple effect would be unbelievable. And a colleague of mine just reminded me that in legislative offices, when they get 5 emails or 5 calls about an issue, that moves it up to something that the office actually pays attention to. Just 5. Right? So can you imagine if they're getting like 10 or 15 or 20, like what that would mean for the work that we're all trying to collectively do? So Kathleen is asking, can you share an example of advocacy partnerships with other sectors? Yeah, I think there's some really good ones. I think I think I can think right now about housing. Right. So throughout Massachusetts, in some parts, it's really hard to live. Right. Housing is really expensive. And I'm sure some of us have been looking at apps like Zillow or Redfin and noticing housing prices just continue to skyrocket. And there's displacement that happens when there's a lot of when housing gets really expensive. And individual artists or creative workers or arts administrators are facing that displacement just alongside other families or other communities that have lived in neighborhoods for generations and now find themselves being priced out of the market. And that's a place where it's not about necessarily saying artists need a dedicated building for their housing, but saying there needs to be more affordable housing and more housing options in this neighborhood. And can we think about how to embed arts and culture and creativity into these spaces? Can we make a co-working space in the basement that acts as a studio space? But the whole point is there needs to be more housing, right? And so that's a place where those issues are intersecting. G, can you think of another one?
I keep going back to this example, but I think it's a good one. And it's so there's a building in Chinatown that to me represents the good and bad of this whole process. And by that, I mean, there was an empty lot in Chinatown called Parcel C. And the city wanted to give it to Tufts to build a 350 car garage, Tufts Medical Center. The community had been fighting for that space to build community, to be able to use for the community itself, the Chinatown community. It literally took decades of fighting in terms of resisting legislature, in terms of bringing in environmental impact studies, and all that. But what stands there now is a building that has middle income housing, affordable housing, space for nonprofit social programming, and space for youth programming and arts. So all those players, the youth organizers, the housing organizers, the labor organizers, and the social service programs, all joined together in resistance to that garage that resulted in that building being put up. So, but can you imagine if those individual forces were separate? Would they be able to stand up against the entities such as the city and Tufts Medical Center? So that would be a concrete example I would share with you. And in many ways, we don't have a choice, once again, is that we have to leverage our power, which is in the number of people that will benefit from these policies, as opposed to more resources and access that larger entities possess. So this has been a long-going trend of work.
I want to take a beat and just help to share some helpful hints, right? Or helpful tips. So one of the things, and we're talking about elected officials, is like, how do you get to them? Like, how do you, who are these mythical beings who we elect, we see on the ballot every couple of years? Well, there's a couple of different ways, right? So first of all, they all have their emails on that masslegislative.org or .gov account, right? So you can reach out to any of your legislators. In fact, on those accounts, you're going to see their email, you're going to see their phone numbers, you're even going to see what their office numbers are, right? And in non-COVID times, right, when the State House is open, you can drop by, right? And there's someone whose job it is just to sit at those desks and welcome people when they arrive, and either take the information that they're sharing, whether it's a flyer or, a piece of research or a storytelling piece that they want to share, or help them better understand, direct them to, if you want to make a meeting with the senator, here's how to do it, right? Then there's also, so there's all of that information. Then there's also social media, right? And Twitter is where most politicians live. They don't just hang out there, but almost every politician and an elected official has a Twitter account. And that's actually a place where a lot of elected officials use to communicate the work that they're doing on behalf of their constituents. And I think for all of us, it's a great practice to get into. Like, I am in part of my job, I follow all of the members of our legislature that have Twitter accounts, because I routinely see where, in fact, some of them even tell me why they voted a certain way on a certain bill, right? So you get more information that way. The other piece is that what I noted is at the beginning of COVID, a lot of legislators began holding virtual coffee and office hours, right? Before the pandemic, oftentimes they would schedule times in their districts to meet with their constituents, right? It was just like, come have coffee with, Senator Ruddock and learn more about what she's up to these days, right? And in the midst of the pandemic, they shifted to making Zoom or virtual coffee hours. And they share that on their social media. Again, can you imagine what would happen if at every coffee hour that a rep had, there was somebody from the creative community, not nagging them and saying, why aren't you doing more for the creative community, but saying like, hey, I just want to update you on the work that we've been doing over the last month. We were able to provide free art supplies to all the kids in our community who were learning virtually. And like from that, a lot of kids were more engaged in their classes, so telling those good news stories and finding opportunities to share that information, you can do that in a couple of different ways. So those are some helpful hints. Are there other questions that folks have? No.
I want to just touch on something really quick, and I didn't want to come across as if we're not addressing it, because we're not talking about it so much at this moment. But the practice of organizing and advocating equitably is really important to us in the way we do our work. And I wanted to highlight that as an additional sort of, if we think about this work as layered, knowing all the basics of how legislation works. Layer one, we need that in order to have influence and impact. Knowing sort of the additional layer of how do we gather and galvanize our communities. Layer two, and then those relationships. And then the third layer of how do we address and change inequities that are inherent in the current process. And that's a third additional layer that is not easy. And we don't want to say that just because we can name all these things, that it can just happen. So I want people to also understand as a takeaway that this process in some ways is more of an art than a skill. There's skill, there's people who do it well, but there are nuances within it that are not necessarily do this, this works, do this, don't do this, this doesn't work. It's about that constant balance of when you have an advocate or an ally in office, how do you speak to them so that you are supporting their work? If you have someone with a slightly different vision of the arts than you have, how do you pressure in a very nice way their understanding of where your perspective is? So what we're trying to do today is just lay it all out, and then hopefully we can have deeper and conversations about it, as well as bring it into the practice. Because like I said, art forms, you don't get good the first time around. And I feel like a lot of people get a little discouraged, the couple of times around to this process. But I wanted to acknowledge that and hopefully understand the importance of it so that we can stick to it a little bit.
Awesome. So with that said, thank you, G. Thanks for holding that in focus for us. We will be back on Tuesday, the 29th for our second session at 3:00. We're going to get pretty technical and learn more about what you can and can't do as a 501c3 nonprofit organization when we're talking about advocacy and lobbying. Do also going to share some pretty concrete examples about how organizations have embedded advocacy into their work. And then we're going to do some we're going to share some exercises where you can think about sharing your organization's story of impact for broader, larger advocacy efforts. So I think that's all from us. Gee, thanks so much. I learned a whole bunch from you. I appreciate you.
I'm sending you the check already.
Well, thank you, Emily and G. This was amazing. And thank you for taking the time out to provide some 101 for all of us, because sometimes the process is a mystery. And I do feel like folks get overwhelmed because there is that professional, those paid lobbyists, those people out there. And sometimes as a person, you feel that the mountain is too hard to climb when it comes to that. And I think a good takeaway is it really the constituent. And a lot of times those paid folks who are lobbyists don't necessarily vote. And so they may not even be constituents themselves. So thank you for providing that expertise to us. I put into the chat for everybody, if you want to register for Tuesday's session next week. It is our final webinar in the series. So we're super excited to have the two of you wrap us out with all of this. So this is the last one here. And for those of you who are interested in the rest of the series that we've had this whole spring, you can see everything right there. So again, thank you, G and Emily, and thank you for everyone for attending today's webinar. Stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you Tuesday. Thank you.
Thank you.